Hi everyone, love, light, and blessings. This is Shamanic Awek Priestess. And I actually wanted to make this video for a long time. It's just that sometimes there are certain videos I'm leery of making because I don't know, some people get triggered by certain things, but at the same time, this is my channel. And I do feel like it's important for me to share this video. I don't know exactly what I'm going to title this video. We just, last month was Black History Month. This is Women's History Month. I made a video recently about supporting our Asian community, especially with what recently happened in Georgia. It does not discount all the other anti-Asian hate crimes that have been committed. Over 3,000 actually, as of yesterday when I was watching the news. So especially since 2020 when coronavirus, happened, the pandemic. So I do have that video if you guys want to watch that video. I will leave the link down below and things like that. I'm probably going to link other videos as well in the link down below for you guys because it might be important for this video that I'm going to talk about. So a lot of the comments that I get when it was Black History Month, I talked about the American Indian, the Native American, the indigenous influences in a lot of the ATRs, okay? A lot of the Caribbean spirituality, such as the Spiritismo, has a heavy influence in the island of Puerto Rico, okay? I'm not talking about Spiritismo in general in other places. There's other places that practice Espiritismo or some sort of Espiritismo and things like that, but specifically talking about Puerto Rico, there's heavy Taino influences in that religious practice or spiritual practice. Some people say it's religious, some people say it's spiritual. There is Taino influences in Santeria, which derived from Ifa. There is Taino influences in Haitian Voodoo. I've always said on my channel, Danto literally, not only did she fight on the behalf of enslaved Africans, she also fought on the behalf of the enslaved, and often side genocide, mass killings of the Taino, the Arawaks, okay? So that's basically what the topic of this video is going to be about. There's this, I'm not going to say new, but most people in the islands that speak Spanish identified as either Hispanic, Latino, Spanish descent, that kind of thing. Even though coming into America, depending on what your physical traits are, being that America is very heavy on racial identity, okay? Some people will be like, but that's a black person, but that's a Native American person. Why are they saying Latino? And all this stuff. Oh, they're ashamed or whatever. So I kind of wanted to get really deep into the Latino heritage or the Latino identity, if you will. I'm going to stay to my lane because I always believe in staying in my lane, meaning I cannot speak for every single Latino. I am one person, so I do not represent all Puerto Ricans or Caribbeans or Latinos. So basically a disclaimer, because a lot of times a person of color makes a video and then all of a sudden that person becomes like, that's how we all think. And no, everybody has their own opinions, their own ideas. So this is going to be people that I've had interactions with. I also did some research, historical research, also based on my life experiences, what I've been taught, what I have personally studied. So for those of you that don't know, when I went to college, one of the things that I studied was more of a diverse history. So I studied the history, African history, African American history. I also studied the history of Puerto Rico. Okay, so I did make sure when I was in college that I studied not just the European history. A lot of times American history and histories in other parts of the world are very whitewashed or told from the perspective of the conqueror or the victors, if you will. So when I became an adult, I actually thought that, and this is going to be controversial, that Puerto Rican was a race. Yes, Puerto Rican is is an identity. It's, what's your nationality? Puerto Rican. Yes. If you are descendant of Puerto Rico, your nationality is Puerto Rican. But nationality or ethnic groups such as Latino, okay, is technically not a race, even though it's part of the census now. And I'm going to explain why it's part of the census and why some people identify as Latino, even if some people think they say, but that's a black person, or that's a white person, or that's an indigenous presenting person. I'm going to explain to you why. It goes really deep. And so history is very important to understand the identity, okay? Then you have some people now that it's becoming a movement. They say Afro-Latino, Indigenous Latino, or some people say Latino. Some people identify as Latinx if they're non-binary, things of that nature, okay? So let's start from the beginning. Again, this one's specifically based on Puerto Rico. I'm going to do another video that's based on Haiti, but I wanted to keep it separate, okay? Again, Puerto Rico, okay? Because I'm picking the nationalities that I identify with, right? Puerto Rican, Haitian. My race, that's a completely different thing. Culture, Latin, Caribbean culture, correct, but my race is not Latino. My race is, I am a mixed race person of both African descent and Arawak descent. And yes, there's a little European there, but that was involuntary, so it's not, I don't really claim my European side because I don't present myself. I'm not white passing. So that's why I always say African descent and I always say Native American descent. Does that make sense? Okay. So let's get into it. I made some notes and everything. So these are the points that I want to make. So Christopher Columbus, of Italian descent, okay, came into the New World, right? He discovered, cannot stand Christopher Columbus, in 1493. So he didn't really discover it. He accidentally landed there, thought he was going to India, whatever the case may be, aka why native indigenous people were called Indians. So in 1493, he accidentally bumped into the island of Borinquen. Originally, Puerto Rico was called Borinquen. Puerto Rico got its name through colonization. That's what the conquistador, so the Spanish explorers, called the island because of all the gold it had. It was literally a rich port. So during the 15th century, there was approximately 20,000 to 50,000 Tainos that lived in Puerto Rico, okay? Their tribe was the Taino tribe, the main tribe that was in Puerto Rico at the 15th century, okay, when they were pretty much found accidentally by Christopher Columbus, the conquistadors, and all these people. They called themselves Borinqueños, Tainos, and their race was Arawak. Is why if you look at my name, is shamanic Arawak priestess. Shamanic because I believe any type of earth-based religious practice is shamanism, such as there are African shamans and there's also Native American shamans. So shamanic is my reclaiming of both my African ancestry and my Taino Arawak lineage. And that's why there's shamanic, so that's claiming both my black and indigenous side. Arawak as a tribute to my people of my Taino lineage, and priestess as a recognition of the Afro-Caribbean religious practices that I have had the honor to be initiated into. So my YouTube name actually has a lot of spiritual names behind it. I dream of the name, the spirits gave me my name. I've copyrighted my name. I copyrighted my name because it's something the spirits themselves gave to me. So that's why I go under that name. So it actually has a lot of deep meaning. It's me reclaiming my culture that has that through colonization and through the history of in the past and even up to today, we have been continued. Black and indigenous people have continued to be suppressed, or at least tried to be suppressed and colonized and divided and trying to conquer us, trying to destroy our identity. Identity is important, okay? So there were 20,000 to 50,000 Tainos, aka Arawak, native people, indigenous people. They were inhabiting the island of Puerto Rico, originally called Eborinque. That's why you see a lot of Puerto Ricans from the island say, "Yo soy Boricua, pa que tú lo sepa." It is a way to reclaim our Arawak lineage. Some people even say it, don't even know what it means, but that was the original intentions of it, okay? So what happened to the Tainos? For centuries, we have been told a lie that the Tainos were completely extinct. When I learned that in school, I remember I did a paper on the Tainos because I always saw like an Indian statue in my mother's like altar. So we grew up in Espiritismo, Santeria, and some of the family practice voodoo. Like, all three. Not all together, but different people practice different things. I had the Santeria influences, the Loa influences growing up, and Espiritismo, okay? My mother didn't tell me that, but I come to realize it as she was teaching me. I was like, Mom, that's voodoo. Okay, moving on. So when this was going on, I always remember seeing an Indio statue and a Madama statue. She would feed them coffee. And I'm like, Mommy, why do you have all these Indian statues? And she's like, because we're Tainos. I'm like, we're Native American? Like, I didn't know. It was like middle school. So I started researching the Tainos. I got really fascinated by that. And I was always told growing up, because my mom always had my hair treated. So it was always like straightened, texturized. So I always had straight hair, but my hair wasn't naturally straight though. And so people were like, yeah, you look Native American. Why are you shocked? So I remember in elementary school, I had a teacher who literally was singing 1 little, 2 little, 3 little Indians, 4 little, 5 little, 6 little Indians. And I told her, oh, my grandmother, because we all knew that, is Native American. I didn't put the 2 and 2 together like she's Native American, therefore you aren't part Native American. I would just be like, I'm Puerto Rican, she's Native American. I know. And so she literally was like, why don't you dance in front of the class while we sing the song? Like, now looking at it, very inappropriate, very improper. This was the 80s. I know it wasn't that long ago, but people even in the 80s were very ignorant, and still to this day are very ignorant about indigenous people. And I danced for her. Like, this is how my grandmother danced, when she would do spiritual things. Moving on. So, I know I need to go back on track what I was talking about. So let's get back to this. So, 90% of the Tainos, okay, died, okay, and there was a 90% of a population decrease when they colonized Puerto Rico through Christopher Columbus and the other conquistadores. That of smallpox, because that was never a thing. There were illnesses that the Europeans brought into Puerto Rico, okay. Also, the reason why the Puerto Ricanos, the Tainos, the Arawaks, didn't attack these people, because you might ask that. One, they were a very peaceful tribe. They were not a war tribe. And two, because when they came in ships. They were like, what are they, like they say, oh, they came in white clouds. And they thought that these men were gods. So they thought that they were immortal, that they could never die, that they were ever existing, and that maybe they did something, or they were very confused, like why these gods are coming. They even pinched the skins of the white men, trying to figure out why they were so pale, because they've never seen people like this. Remember, everybody was brown, there were one race of people there. So you have to look at it from that time period, not in today's time period. And when they finally found out, because one of the Tainos accidentally killed them, because they were literally, taking babies out of the women's wombs, enslaving them, torturing them, experimenting on them, raping them, pillaging them, and all these things, and introducing diseases. Okay, the Tainos were enslaved and forced to work in the gold mines to take out the gold from Puerto Rico. Okay, and the Tainos are native people. They live throughout the Caribbean, okay, and even in Florida. All right, For example, and this does not include everybody. I'm just naming some islands off the top of my head: Puerto Rico, Cuba, Jamaica, Santo Domingo, Haiti, etc., etc. Okay, so a lot of us in the islands are cousins. We're descended from the Arawaks, the Tainos, okay, the Caribes, so on and so forth. Um, and so they enslaved them in the gold mines. They starved them, everything else. A lot of the Tainos, once they found out that white men can die, okay, and when I say white men, I'm talking about Italians at this time. I'm talking about Spaniards. A lot of people are like Spaniards or brown people. No, the original Spaniards were of white race. They are in Europe. Spain and Portugal are in Europe. And so therefore the dominant race in Spain was white. So a lot of times people are like, why they call those white people? Because that's how they identify, blancos, okay? Blancos, okay? So they identified as white. They were white. They had darker hair, but they had white skin. A lot of Latinos that are white Latinos are direct descendants of the Spaniards, okay? Direct descendants of the Spaniards. So they just spoke Spanish. Their language was Spanish, but their race at that time, and a majority of Spaniards are white. If that's offensive, I'm sorry, but these are facts. A lot of Spaniards are white. Blanquitos, we call them blanquitos, blancos. You know what I mean? Moving on. So, and Portuguese. There was a predominant slavery with the people of Portugal, of Portuguese, the Dutch, the French, okay? Then came the Americans. So, you know, the British and all of that. But I'm just saying, in the Caribbean, in the beginning, it was mostly these three, and then everybody else added to it, okay? So they were enslaved. They were, you know, having to dig out gold. A lot of them died of that labor. A lot of them also died killing the Spaniards. Once they found out, hey, they're not gods, they could die because somebody accidentally killed them. They refused to grow crops, okay? Some of them bled to death because when they protested and revolted, their hands were chopped off and they bled to death, you know? They died of famine because of bad working conditions, not being fed, overwork, all these things. They didn't last a long time. Diseases such as smallpox, okay? And some of them did mass poisoning. They poisoned themselves with cassava. They did cassava poisoning. And some that escaped to the mountains were hunted down by dogs, okay? However, some of the Tainos escaped. And this is why I'm bringing it back to middle school. I was like, wait a minute. If some of the Tainos escaped, how are you telling me that my people are extinct? That never sat right for me, especially because in the islands, like, you know, in my experience growing up in Puerto Rico, migrating to the United States and all of this, we are very proud of the Tainos. I'm like, how can they be dead if there's so much of their language in our culture? There's so much spirituality that's infused with their spirituality, especially if we're talking about Espiritismo. There's so much veneration and honor that they give to the Indio spirits in Espiritismo. So I'm just saying, and they come through and rituals and all this. Their culture, that ancestry within the Taino people is very alive. So how could that be? So that never made sense to me. The Tainos that escaped now, because you know now people are finally starting to recognize certain things, right? So I learned as I got older in college and everything that some of the Tainos escaped to the mountains, okay? And then they were mixed with either Spaniard or African people. Just because someone mixes their race does not mean that that race is extinct. That makes no sense. Because if you think about it, there's no such thing really, like the majority of everybody, and ancestry has proved that most people have some type of mixture. No matter how you physically present, because of colonization, because of intermarriages and all of that, a lot of people have mixed historically. It's very rare you find 100% anything. Like it happens, but it's not as common, right? Yes, you might be 80% white, but there might be 20% something else. You might be 90% white, but there might be other stuff. You know what I mean? You might be 90% African descent, but you might have 10% white. Like, and a lot of people see that in their ancestors, like, wait, I have Irish and all that. Yes, because some of us, and historically, have mixed and mingled and all this stuff, sometimes by choice, most of the time not, if we go back in history. So just because the Tainos mixed with the Europeans or mixed with Africans does not take away the fact that they're still Tainos. You know, indigenous people are the only race of people that the government wants you to literally prove that's what you are. The government literally tells you what you are and things of that nature. As of today, there are over 500 indigenous tribes that are of indigenous descent that have kept their culture intact, that the government refuses to give federal tribal recognition. Why is that important? The reason why that's important is because lands that were stolen by the government, they won't be able to get any type of government land or reparations for the fact that the first inhabitants were literally, their lands were taken away, they were enslaved, and so on and so forth. And in many cases, mass genocides, okay? That's why that's important. It supposedly gives you government protection, even though, let's be real, there's a lot of stuff going on in the reservations, but that's a video for another day. So that's why in Puerto Rico, they wanted people to think, you know, that we don't exist. And I'm going to get deeper into that, okay? So right there, I'm just telling you, Tainos are not extinct. They may have racially and ethnically mixed because of colonization, but they are not extinct. And yes, there are some people that are pretty much mostly purely Taino too. Let's keep it real. Okay, so let's bring it back. Now I'm giving you the historical, but you're going to be like, but that doesn't prove anything. Now we're going to talk about science. So according to a study conducted by the National Science Foundation, okay, this is a real study, people, 61% of the Puerto Ricans from the island that were tested, okay, 61% of the island's population that was tested has the original Taino Arawak DNA. But how could they get that? How did they get that? They actually took DNA from original Tainos, because yes, their skeletons exist, and matched it up with today's modern Puerto Ricans or Boricuas that inhabit the island, and 61% of those people have Taino DNA. I am one of them. I have a significant amount of Taino DNA within my ancestry, and I have a significant amount of African DNA within my ancestry, okay? So if 61% of the modern day Puerto Ricanos, aka Boricuas, have the original Taino Arawak DNA, and it was said that they have a significant amount of DNA, what does that mean? That the Tainos, scientifically proven here, have never died. This is something that Boricuas have always known. And so this is why Espiritismo and religions like that, Santeria and Voodoo, that has Taino influences, that is the legacy that our Tainos left behind for us. This is why when we venerate El Indio, which I do, I venerate and honor all of my Taino ancestors within all the practices that I practice. This is why these are closed traditions, because our native people to this day are lied to and told that their race of people have been extinct. But why? Because money. We also have to understand the history of Puerto Rico. Since 1892, okay, we were ruled by the Spaniards and colonized by the Spaniards, but it did not end there. Since the 15th century. But then Americans promised to give us our freedom, took over Puerto Rico in 1898 and other U.S. territories, okay? And we were not allowed to self-rule. We had European people, American people being governors in our island. Puerto Ricans in the island were granted citizenship in the early 1900s, but that was only because they wanted us to fight in their wars. So a native Puerto Riqueño in Puerto Rico can fight for America, okay? A native Puerto Rican can die for this country, but is not allowed to vote for the president. I'll say it again. A Puerto Rican or anyone of a U.S. territory is allowed, and oftentimes when you guys had the draft, we were drafted, okay? So forced to or can volunteer to fight for this country, but is not allowed to vote for any U.S. presidential election. We have representatives in U.S. territories that are allowed to represent us but have no say and no vote on any laws that are governed in our countries. Puerto Rico to this day is a colony. This is why you have people fighting for statehood or liberation. The status of Commonwealth, when the Hurricane Maria happened in Puerto Rico, it was a lackluster effort. Barely anybody donated because Puerto Ricans to this day, a lot of people don't even understand that they're part of the United States of America. We are American citizens by birth. But we are, as many U.S. territories are, the ugly stepchild. Okay, we are the abused stepchild because we do not enjoy the same protections as states. This is why there's still money to this day from the hurricane being held in Puerto Rico. It's being held. Okay, they're still waiting for that funding. The island was fixed by its own people. Okay, a lot of times people make fun of Puerto Rico. There's a $72 billion debt in Puerto Rico because unlike any other state that has a debt, we cannot declare bankruptcy. So therefore, we, the Puerto Rican people, have to pay for it. This is why there was a mass migration to the United States, because people in Puerto Rico pay one of the highest taxes. I just wanted to, more money is taken from my island than is actually given. That common misconception that we are somehow a charity case is a false narrative. We are actually exploited, and we're going to examine more of that in this video. It's going to be a long one, guys. It's going to be a long one. So the reason why 500 tribes is because they will have to give us land, reparations, all this stuff. That is also something that happened in Puerto Rico. If they were to recognize that 61% of Puerto Ricans are actually of Taino descent, they will have to give us land. They will have to give us reparations because the Tainos were the first inhabitants. So that's why. Okay, so in Taino spirituality, they had a main god called Yucayu. He was a sky god, or he is a sky god. And then they also have a god of the ocean, Atabe, which is God's son. He watches over the Taino people, okay? So again, 61% of the population is indigenous. Now, African ancestry, despite popular misconception, in the media, you see a lot of white passing Puerto Ricans, Daddy Yankee, Jennifer Lopez, blah, 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 blah. And so a lot of people think that's how all Puerto Ricans look in Island. No. I remember when I took my kids, my daughter was like, hey, there's a lot of people that look like me, a lot of black presenting people. Yes, because even though a lot of Puerto Ricans will identify as white, as Blanco, okay, Spaniard, so mostly identifying as Spaniards because of the language we speak, right? Actually, 60% of Puerto Ricans have significant African ancestry, okay? Why? You're going to be like, why? Okay, so basically, the majority of Puerto Ricans are actually people of color in the sense of mostly Native and African descent, and then the rest, white, like actual white. Okay, so it doesn't mean like some of them of the 60% are mixed race, some of them aren't. Okay, so the first black people that came to Puerto Rico were actually libertos, so free people of color that accompanied the Spaniards. But it was the actual Spaniards that enslaved the Tainos. I just want to make sure we have that disclaimer here. And then later on, with the Taino population died out, when they started building, freedom towns, escaping to the mountains, intermarrying African people that, the libertos and the Tainos intermarried, had children. So not all people that are of Puerto Rican descent are actually descendants of slavery, but they still have African descent because some of them were from the libertos, okay? So when they started bringing the African people into Puerto Rico through the Atlantic slave trade, okay, approximately 10.7 million people were brought throughout slavery, through the diaspora. So 10.7 million people were taken away from Africa to be enslaved in various parts of the world, okay? Mostly from Africa, West Africa, Yoruba, Nigerian, Dahomey, so on and so forth. The 7 African tribes, okay? By 1555, there were 15,000 enslaved Africans not slaves, enslaved Africans, okay, because the Africans, they're not slaves, they were enslaved, they were in forced slavery. Just like the Tainos were in forced slavery, they were still Tainos, okay? So there were 15,000 African people that were forced to be enslaved, okay? They were raped, they were coerced. A lot of times the Spaniards were more angrier at the Tainos because the Tainos just would keep killing themselves and things of that. And the reason why, like, but the thing is, that's a common misconception too, because the African slaves were fighting too. Okay, they were fighting. They brought their religions, aka how Ifa practices came to islands of Puerto Rico, Santo Domingo, Haiti, so on and so forth, because the Yoruba people were practicing their religions in secret. One of the advantages that the islands had was that the Spaniards, the Italians, were predominantly Christian, were predominantly Catholic. So they were able to infuse their spirits into the saints, okay? AKA Santeria, all that stuff. Okay, there were slave revolts such as El Grito de Lares and other efforts, okay? By 1873, slavery was finally abolished in Borinquen, aka Puerto Rico, okay? Some of the Africanos that were enslaved were later able to buy their freedom. That happened in America too. Some of them married within their own race, and some of them married within the Tainos. Okay, and this is how we got the inhabitants of the island, which are mostly mixed race people. Okay, mostly mixed race people. And so when people are mixed race, it gets hard to identify, like, so what race am I? So most of us just say Puerto Rican because it's easier, because we're so mixed down. So that's why. And in the Caribbean, it's always nation or nationality first, race later kind of thing, but we still keep the cultural practices, okay? What else? Now, out of those 10.7 million Africans that were brought into the New World to be enslaved, the Caribbean got about 5 million. So half of that went to the Caribbean, okay? And other parts of the world, Brazil, so on and so forth, okay? Just want to make sure. Yes, I have all my notes, okay? Now, some of these African people were brought into the United States, okay? A lot of times, they have this narrative where they try to divide Black people from different parts of the world. So they try to divide Black Americans, Afro-Latinos, and anyone of African descent, okay? I always say colorism is a form of colonization. Dividing dark-skinned people, medium-complected people, and light-skinned people is Jim Crow and colonization. That happened a lot within the United States. It also happened in the island of Puerto Rico because, again, we're U.S. territory. So while the United States was segregated, so was Puerto Rico. Okay, you had to have an ID card that identified what your racial was. Black, so B for Black, C for colored, and W for white, okay? So that one drop rule did apply to Puerto Rico as well. So in the United States, it said that 388,000 African people in the beginning were brought to the United States for the purposes of enslavement. The majority of the 10.7 million people went to the Caribbean and South America. So there are people in South America that are also of African descent that mix down with either the white population or the indigenous population. There are people in the Caribbean that are, some people didn't mix down in some places as much as others, case being Panama, Jamaica, and things like that. But you still have multicultural, multiracial people in the Caribbean, even Jamaicans. You have Jamaicans can come in all different colors, shapes, all that stuff. Puerto Ricans too. Like, you can have light, dark, medium complected, like just rainbow, because again, it has to do with colonization, intermarrying, so on and so forth. So most of the African people were brought to the Caribbean and South America. One of the biggest places they brought the African slaves to, Haiti, Brazil. Brazil has one of the largest Black populations in the world. Seriously. So does Cuba. Okay, moving on. So Brazil received alone 4.86 million. So they have the biggest slave trade, Brazil. And then like Haiti's like under that, okay? All right, so About 60,000 to 70,000 more enslaved Africans were taken to the island and then brought to the United States. Okay, so some of them passed maybe to Santo Domingo, Puerto Rico, Haiti, Brazil, and then were put on ships and then brought to the United States. Okay, so altogether that's 450,000 Africans that were brought to the Americas. Okay, 42 million people within recent polling are descended from these first original 450,000 African people that were brought into America. So once slavery was abolished, okay, just like the United States suffered from colorization and racism, colorism, sorry, racism, Jim Crow, all these things. In Puerto Rico, the same thing was happening. We had these arrangements because the thing about Puerto Ricans too, before I forget, the reason why Puerto Ricans got so mixed down with so many races, like Spaniards and all that stuff, you know, and a lot of other islands did too, was because when the Spaniards came to conquer the New World, they didn't bring any women. So some of them will actually incest and marry their own family that they brought with them, or have an imported wife. But the majority of them would either rape an indigenous woman and then be like, yeah, that's, you know, never really marry them, but like claim them, have children with them, blah, blah, blah. Or the same thing they would do with some of the lighter skin enslaved women. Okay, so they would do that with some of the African people, and people started to mix down. Okay, and that's AKA the beginning of colorization, because these mixed race people somehow thought they were better than the African people, you know, or the non-mixed native people. So I know it's very sad, but that's what's going on, because they were treated better. The mixed race people were treated better than the people that were not mixed race. Okay, there was like a hierarchy, and unfortunately to this day there's a lot of that type of division within the people of color, the black and brown communities. You know, they try to divide us by skin color, you know, and it's really sad. It's really sad. So they started forming this thing called, when they were doing segregation and all this stuff, something called conjunto iguales. So what does a conjunto iguales means? It's like a civil union, not a marriage or an understanding. So basically like two people living together kind of thing. So I know in New Orleans they had something called the quadroon balls. So in Puerto Rico they had a similar practice, kind of, not with a ball, but so in my family, when one of my aunts, she started researching our ancestry and all of that, she discovered that my mother's grandmother, my great grandmother, was actually not legally married to her husband. She actually was a concubine, or in a conjunto iguale, like an agreement, a legal agreement. So basically what that means, her mother, who was of African descent, and mixed Taino too, but she presented as African, had a daughter who was born more with the Taino features, and she was very dark skinned. Because of the history that she had, my great grandmother was identified as black. Her birth certificate says black. My great grandmother was identified as colored, so someone of mixed race. That's how they were identified as back in the days. She, I guess, felt that it was better for her to enter this agreement with a white European man of Portuguese and Spaniard descendancy. So that's why I do have Portuguese in my DNA as well, more that than Spaniard. I don't have that much Spaniard. And I realized it was because of this person. They entered into agreement with my great grandfather, who took her. She was promised to him at the age of 9, and he took her as a young girl, because she was a young teenage girl, as to be with him. Okay, we have to look at the context of this. This was the early 1900s. Sharecropping was a thing. There was times in Puerto Rico people would take blood tests to prove you weren't black. Like, it was just a lot of sick stuff going on, and a lot of segregation, extreme poverty, and things like that. We were already 1898 ruled by the United States government, they forced us to separate by race, okay? This is why a lot of Puerto Ricans have a hard time saying, oh, I'm black, because of that history, because of that colonization. So they started claiming just Puerto Rican, this sense of nationalism over everything else, because Puerto Rico has always been oppressed. We have always been the property of someone. People have always tried to erase our identity. But we still are very proud of our African roots. We still practice the Afro-Caribbean religions and all these things. Not everybody, because you have your Catholics and your Protestants, but there's still a lot of Puerto Ricans that do practice these things, okay? All right, going back. And I'm not talking about Puerto Rican Americans in the United States. I'm talking about specifically in the island. So it's just done in secret. So some people be like, that's not true. Well, it depends what part. If you live in San Juan, that's different. There's a lot of tourism there, blah, blah, blah. But if you go back into the Campos, it's a whole different lifestyle. Okay. So when they had us identify as different things, okay, my grandmother entered into this disgusting pedophilia contract, okay? Her mother just thought that was the best for her. She had children with him, I believe 5, one of them being my grandmother. And she was identified as colored. But when looking at more recent documentation, it changed to white. Why? Because the Puerto Ricans that could pass for white, that's what they did. And this is why you have some Puerto Rican, even if they have some indigenous or African ancestries, will still say like, I'm just like that, you know, just I'm Spanish. You know, I'm black, I'm white, you know, because of the privilege and the different way that people of color are treated versus the people that could pass for something else. So my grandmother was one of those people. I found out she couldn't read. I never knew that. My mom was like, that explains a lot. My mother, that means that her children were the first generation within my mother's side of the family that could read. And these are all consequences of these things, of sharecropping. You know, my great grandmother to this day never said who her daughter's father was. So we all assume she must have gotten raped. Something must have happened. She went to work in somebody's house and then she was pregnant. You know what I mean? So, and this is just one of the stories, one family, you know. So yes, we are descendants of slaves as well. A lot of people throughout the world are literally descendants of this transatlantic slave trade. And that's why I made this channel, because I wanted to let my beautiful African American brothers and sisters know that I understand, you know, that we're united, that we're one, that we all have a similar history, that a lot of us throughout the diaspora have been displaced, and enslaved and colonized, but we can rise up as a people. And the only way we can do that is by knowing our history and uniting in those truths. To this day, you have Latinos that don't even know they have African ancestry or Native American ancestry. They don't know. You know, you ask them, I don't know, Latino. And that's a common thing. People from the diaspora, a lot of times our history is so hidden. A lot of times you have people that are very religious, and so they're like, oh, that stuff is demons, 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 demons. Don't practice, don't pray to those black spirits. That's something that happens within people of color. It happens. That's part of colonization. That's part of racial cleansing. Okay, so Theodore Roosevelt, one disgusting person, really wanted to racially cleanse Puerto Rico. He felt that Puerto Rico was overpopulated because we were literally mongrels that didn't know any better, lacked intelligence, and we just breeded too much. Okay, why am I talking about this? Because from the 1930s to the 1970s, the majority of people that were affected by this were poor people and people of color. So indigenous Puerto Ricanos and Africans, so Afro-Puerto Ricans, were affected with this at the highest level. He decided to basically pass a law that very few people know about. This was called La Operación, so the operation. And literally, he wanted to decrease the population of Puerto Rico. There was a time in Puerto Rico we were not allowed to talk Spanish. There was a time in Puerto Rico we were not allowed to even be proud of our Puerto Rican flag. Okay. We were also victims to Operation Bootstrap, where they brought predominantly Spanish-speaking Puerto Ricans into different parts of the United States for cheap labor with immigrants, and they could treat us however they wanted to because we didn't speak English, we didn't know our rights. So it was like sharecropping, pretty much. That separated us by races, like I said, forced us to identify as race, which was something we never did before. And they also did sterilization. Also, a lot of people don't know to this day, a lot of the medicines that you guys take, when they say we tested this, are involuntarily tested on the Puerto Rican population. So we share a common history with our Black American brothers and sisters of being experimented on. This is why COVID-19 vaccinations are controversial for people of color. I'm sorry, we don't trust doctors and medicine and the medical community like everybody else. Gynecology, modern day gynecology, Planned Parenthood and places like that literally tested on enslaved Africans, okay, our Black brothers and sisters and our Native American brothers and sisters. And that's why you have all these gynecological advances. And these people, all these procedures and stuff were done with no anesthesia. So we are people that have been experimented on and continue to be experimented on. Okay, another video for another day. So La Operación, or the sterilization program that they made into law in Puerto Rico, they literally sterilized a third of the female population of Puerto Rico. Most of this was involuntary. Even the consent wasn't consensual because pressured consent. So what do I mean by that? In order for a pregnant woman to give birth in the hospital, the majority of them were made to sign a consent form that we will deliver your baby, but we will sterilize you. Yeah. If not, give birth at home and be at your own risk. Also, other people were taken to the doctor for other reasons and came out sterile. Okay? This was called Law 116, which made sterilization legal and free or very low cost. But it was a law with a very dark and horrible intention. It was literally to decrease the population of Black Puerto Ricans and Native American or poor Puerto Ricans. So they wanted to reduce the number of people of color in the island. They wanted the white Puerto Ricans, or the white people, to be the majority population of the island of Puerto Rico. This is why to this day, racial identity is very difficult because of the way that we continue to be treated. In our own island, by the way. Okay? Yeah. They had up to 160 free clinics that their main purpose was to sterilize people. Okay, by 1965, 34% of women have been sterilized in the island of Puerto Rico. Schools were being closed because they had not enough students to attend that year, especially the younger children, and they prided themselves in that. So I say this to say that. This is why people ask me so much, why are you so proud of the religions you practice? You speak with so much passion. Sorry, I almost lost power because this video is so long. You speak so passionately about your heritage. Yes, I do. This is why I claim my Tainos, and this is why just as much I claim La Madama, because these are the people that I am descended from. Okay, I am descended from African people that came from Africa involuntarily, okay, involuntarily, and they were enslaved. Okay, so I am a descendant of enslaved people. Okay, I am, and I'm proud to be that. I have Black ancestry, and I thank my enslaved ancestor that I found in the slave schedule in Puerto Rico. I thank her, because if it wasn't for women like her who birthed children, my family line wouldn't have kept going. My religious practice would have kept going. I understand the whips, the mistreatment, and the struggles that she went through and these ancestors went through to keep Santeria, to keep all these practices, espiritismo, and all these things that our ancestors practice intact and alive. Okay, I thank my Tainos, I thank my Africano ancestors for every struggle that they had because they kept my family's bloodline going. I come from a proud people and I claim them every time. And Espiritismo, I get to connect to those energies. In Santeria, I get to connect to those energies. I get to work with deities that were trying, they tried for so long to take away from my people. And I get to reclaim that every time I'm in ritual. I get to reclaim that every time I pray to them. I get to reclaim my history, my lineage, my culture, the colonization and racism and segregation and Jim Crow and La Operación and so many things that were done to our ancestors. We get to reclaim that. And that's why I've dedicated my life to reuniting the diaspora, doing mentorship classes and teaching our people, my African American Black brothers and sisters, Afro Puerto Ricans, Afro Indigenous Puerto Ricans, my Latinos, all my people of the diaspora and Caribbeans and everything else that have a claim to this lineage. I have dedicated my life to teaching us about our cultures, teaching us to reconnect with and reclaim our power, because there is power in these practices and indigenous practices and African. There is power. Our ancestors paved the way and it is our birthright. And that's why I love this whole rebirth of people of color reclaiming their religions and their practices that for too long have been stolen, whitewashed, resold, and taken away from its very people that created it and founded it. And this is why I practice what I practice. And this is why I'm so proud of my cultures, but I'm always so private about it because I understand the trials and tribulations. My great grandmother practiced, my grandmother practiced, my mother practiced, and I practice. And someday my children will be doing their own thing. Yes, they practice with me, but I mean, like, they're gonna take it on for me, and I'm gonna pass that torch to them and my students and everything else. This is why I dedicated my life to this. Knowing our history should not make you sad. It should empower you. It should make you look at and say, wow, they've been through stuff. And if they could do this, then I could do that. And I feel like it actually would empower our people to know that most of us came from the diaspora. Yes, we were descended from enslaved. Yes, we were descended from genocide indigenous people. But at the end of the day, these people, a lot of them fought for their freedom every single day. And so that's what we need to do as honor to them, fight for our freedoms, fight to end racism, and use our spirituality like they did to empower us through these difficult times. And that's why I wanted to make this video. I want to uplift everybody. I want to let you know that these are beautiful traditions. These are not demonized. Don't let these religions tell you that's evil, that's evil, that's evil. Don't let these religions make you feel ashamed. Don't let them make you feel ashamed. I remember when I was part of the Protestant religion, of Pentecostal religion, they literally taught us that Black people were enslaved because they worship false gods. How disgusting is that? They teach you self-hate. They teach you self-hate. And I became to actually acknowledge my Black side and my indigenous side when I came into these religions, because I would see how movies and the media portrayed my people and made them seem less than human and dehumanize them, and all these imageries that I grew up in, and the fetishizing of indigenousness and Blackness and everything else. And it wasn't until I started practicing this, when ancestry DNA actually confirmed this, because ever since I was little, everybody's like, but your mom's Black. Why she always says she's Latino or Puerto Rican? It's a very complex thing. It's a very complex thing. And sometimes some people think if you say Black, you're meaning Black American. So it's a very confusing identity struggle that a lot of mixed race Latino people go through, because sometimes they're like, well, we don't know what to identify with, so they claim Latino. I consider myself a mixed race woman of Black and African ancestry, because that's what I am. And if you ask me culturally, I consider myself Afro-Latina. Okay, that's what I identify as. I am of Afro-Latina culture. Okay, but race-wise, I am a Black and indigenous woman. So hopefully that makes sense. That's why I claim Black History Month. Black History Month is also our history, because I will not ever forget all the beautiful black women within my family and my ancestors who paved the way for me to be able to speak to you on YouTube. Freedoms that I have were freedoms that they could never imagine. And so I must make the best of that, and I must speak to these people. So much love, much light, much blessings. I know this is a long one, so I don't expect nobody to watch the whole thing. I am expecting some controversy on this video because people just want to be like that, or somebody trying to disprove what I said. Ugh, I'm not even going to pay no mind to it. I'm going to make this video regardless of the reaction to it. My hair got messed up during the making of this video, but okay. But anyways, much love, much light, much blessings. Thank you so much for watching this video, guys. Until the next video, which I'm not going to make until, you know, the beginning of next week. So love and light. Bye, guys.